Ranking the Akatsuki has been fundamental in shaping the Naruto power scaling world. However, each and nearly every time that one's been made, it's been done in a very shallow and oversimplified manner of ranking the members, with the creator usually just presenting one straight list, no room for change, or a placement to be argued around depending on another likely interpretation. Others are too vague and don't even really put numbers on it, so today, let's take an actual deep dive into the Akatsuki with the ultimate Akatsuki ranking. I naturally have to segment this up into a few different tiers as the Akatsuki are fundamentally different levels of power in comparison to some members and practically equal to others, which is inherent to their pairings, but we'll get into that. So I'm going to have 3 tiers of fighters. Tier 3, for example, can all fight one another without a blitz or a stomp, but can't beat anyone in Tier 2, and even the weakest member of Tier 2 can beat each member of Tier 3. You get the point, so let's jump in. Opening Tier 1 up with the most contentious set of characters to rank at the Akatsuki, we have Itachi, Pain, and Obito, where the most critical comparison would be between Itachi and Obito, and while many people are quick to assume Obito's peerless superiority, this might not be the case. Having been considered already for Anbu captain, with Danzo even going so far to lie about his age and attempting to guarantee such a position, Itachi at the age of just 12 is already considered to possess outstanding abilities even in comparison to the rest of the strongest clan in Konoha, who are such a military force that Konoha owes its peace to their ultimate effort. Whereas Fireball, something considered by both the third anime profile guides and Fugaku, is the pinnacle of determining what the value of one representing the crest by the one who manipulates fire can now only be matched by Shisui the Teleporter, a prodigy thought to surpass both Minato and the Sannin combined one day, and the Wicked Eye Fugaku, a 4th Hokage candidate, each of the which are shinobi feared by nations, with both boasting renowned MS abilities. Yet, despite this, Itachi is quite a monster, and it's quite telling for why his rivalry with Obito is actually pretty consistent throughout the series, and particularly whenever they encounter one another in the Uchiha basement, where Itachi is soon to be at not just the peak of his clan, but the village at large, despite his age, with his ability around this time exceeding that which he displays in part 1, where he makes sport of the most elite jonin in Konoha, as implied by Kakashi and Data Book 2, wherein upon seeing Obito down there, Itachi engages him for the first time since Obito murdered his teammate Tenma several years ago, using Kamui to literally phase through him and mangle his child friend, where Obito now, still being his sworn enemy, even notes Itachi's growth. Itachi also catches on to how Obito has been using Kamui to weave around certain cameras, meaning that Itachi knows of this aspect of Kamui and the aforementioned phasing one, which was so terrifying Itachi was paralyzed by the phenomenon of Obito's body and couldn't even move due to the pressure, with the two now escape to a moonlit path lined by cedar trees, as also portrayed in the manga, with the novel merely giving further insight into this paramount scene. The narrator, who does make power correlated statements like in Sasuke Shinden stating that he wouldn't let another Kaguya level threat destroy Earth, continues on about how Itachi wouldn't allow Obito to take revenge, with Itachi intervening saying, "I have conditions," cutting straight through Obito's arrogant attitude. "I'll help you get revenge on the Uchiha clan, and in exchange you don't lay a hand on the village or Sasuke Uchiha." Obito by this point was unable to actually hide his shock at the forcefulness of Itachi, a definition of forcefulness being physical energy or intensity, which is very consistent as we'll discuss in a minute. Itachi's face, devoid of all expressions, offered the answer to Obito's questioning, stating, "If he refuses the quest, then you and I are enemies." And Obito just has to ask, "Could you kill me?" And Itachi rebutted with, "It's not a matter of if I can or not. I will kill you." When the two shinobi each acknowledged each other as opponents with no more bloodlust remaining in their auras. And while this scene has been analyzed many times in these videos, I did promise I wouldn't gloss over anything, and many things aren't simply examined enough. Them acknowledging each other as opponents with no more bloodlust remaining in their auras would imply that there was previously bloodlust in their auras, which is pretty consistent with how Itachi forcefully cuts through Obito's arrogant attitude, forcing him into his more serious state, which would imply that via these aura correlations, Itachi is only rivaled by a more serious 20-plus-year-old resisted it. As noted before, Obito would then go on to brutally murder Tenma, which I won't get into too much, but Itachi then tries to state his Konoha affiliation, but couldn't continue and was totally suppressed by Obito's wordless pressure, the narrator stating, quote, "Perhaps his instincts, sensing the difference between his own abilities and those of that man, refused to let him fight," with him also alluding to how he was trying to just process the phenomenon of the man's body. Previously, Itachi was so much weaker than Obito that he was completely overwhelmed by his pressure, something highlighted as a direct indication of power through numerous things in the series like that, or even other things like whether it be Fugaku's pressure to be sensed from the other room, the indescribable pressure of Danzo's words, the pressure of Orochimaru and Hiruzen stare down, Itachi aura potentially suppressing the power of Kisame, the aura of Orochimaru's 8-headed Hydra being what Itachi notes, Tobirama using his aura to show Sasuke's power, you name it. In every median we literally know of, these auras are basically power correlated, whether it be Itachi Shinen novels, the Gaara Hiden novel, the Akatsuki Hiden novels, the manga, etc. It's just all power correlated. Not to mention, it also makes a lot of sense when you account for how like each character has particular qualities of chakra, whether that be powerful, nasty, flavorful, warm, cold, etc. Yet when a few years have passed and years have been dedicated to the honing of his abilities, Itachi can now forcefully cut through that pressure and force Obito to acknowledge him as an opponent while he did the same, with Itachi being confident in certainly killing Obito one way or another. See, while this encounter is brief, it still needs a lot of attention to understand more about where Obito, whose power is yet to be discussed, gained so much respect for Itachi, which has now been presented as why Obito states, quote, "Now that Itachi's dead, the Leaf Village is no longer off limits," referencing his deep unwillingness to break this pact, a pact that, if broken, guaranteed his death by Itachi's hands, sort of implying that Obito may not even disagree with that possibility. Even the third data book mentions Obito's goal of Tsukiyomi and Itachi's death being of a similar priority, and for the most nuclear statement Obito makes about Itachi, adding to why he was weary of testing Itachi, would be him internally monologuing in his head that if Itachi knew everything about me, I'd be dead. This basically confirming that via Obito's own admission, Itachi could kill him if he knew more of his abilities, at least concerning the context of this scene and the Amaterasu trap, more so being that Itachi, had he known more about this trap, and known which abilities to perhaps use, would have killed Obito. Perhaps you could argue that Obito is also talking about a stand-up fight, considering he makes this remark in his head, and it could be of a different context than the trap. It's possible, but I'd probably go with the former interpretation. How Itachi would actually kill Obito in a stand-up fight, however, we don't really know. However, you may be able to pinpoint this away from the Amaterasu if you consider their interaction in the Naruto Road to Ninja movie as canon, which could be possible considering Kishimoto's name is in the credits and he actually drew a mini manga leading into it for the Naruto manga box set 3, showing how he may have held some respect to its canonicity. If you are to accept it, there's a scene where Itachi threatens Obito, saving Sakura, and states, "I take it physical attacks will be ineffective against one such as you. However, I have other cards up my sleeve." Obito then responds by stating, "If you put your mind to it, you could even set me on fire." This will immediately make you think of the Amaterasu due to the fire wording. See what I did there? However, when you consider the Amaterasu did mess Obito up, he still kind of countered it, whether you say it was Izanagi or Kamui. And with the fact that physical attacks won't work and the Amaterasu is stated to be the strongest physical attack, you might be able to rule out the Amaterasu and potentially even imply Tsukiyomi, as the emphasis is on his left eye, which houses the strongest genjutsu, something that's also non-physical, which is pretty interesting and may hold some validity with how he could counter Obito's basic genjutsu without a Sharingan, but it's just a possibility, still only to be granted if you accept this movie as canon. Now, as I point out in my Itachi vs Minato video, Naruto Road to Ninja is displayed as something very intertwined within the manga, as in July 2012, Shonen Jump issue 34 came out, featuring the numerous Road to Ninja character designs by Kishimoto himself, including Naruto, Hinata, Minato, Kushina, Sasuke, as well as only a single day after the release of volume 61, it was coupled with a secret volume for Road to Ninja, which basically was a supplementary guidebook written by Kishimoto, including manga canon material and interviews housing the same authorship style to all 4 data books. Now, ultimately, the chronological timeline for the events of this movie is really awkward. Although we have had arcs get split and separated by other arcs like the Chunin exams and Konoha Crush, so it's not impossible, and the conclusion I think you should draw from this would be something along the lines of the manga material drawn for the movie is probably canon, considering not just all of Kishimoto's involvement, but Shueisha's as well, whereas the anime, movie, and the extra sources are more or less a secondary canon of what could be, so long as nothing is contradictory, at least on a primary level, as the movie does have a lot of weird alterations to detail, ranging from like the pictures in the Okage office being different to an entirely different Jinchuriki being alive. the primary takeaway from this is that Itachi and Obito have a deep-rooted rivalry in the manga, and if one ought to suggest that either of the two would just stomp the other, then they're probably quite misled about the narrative entirely. Even though supplementary materials such as Storm Generations cutscenes, which are said by CyberConnect 2, the producers of the game, to be canon to the anime, at least regarding scenes of Itachi and Minato, wherein Obito states that Itachi had no worthy opponents. So, you see, we know Obito and Itachi both acknowledge one another as a rightfully respected opponent, and neither of the two have a true exact grasp on just how strong one another are, but are more so speculating based on their previous encounters and then their growth in relation. And this is where Itachi seems to look more impressive, as if you recall that Sasuke during the 5 Kage summit, just by virtue of fully activating his MS and utilizing the hatred boiling within him, got several amps to his chakra, making the darkness trace deeper, forcing his chakra to be colder and thicker, and more importantly, more powerful, which each time it also increases his Susanoo ability until he gets unrecognizably stronger, and then some, with each of the latter 2 amps, if not the former, being a display of Sasuke's darkness, being merely the shadow of Itachi's darkness, with his younger brother screaming at the thought of Konoha laughing at Itachi's sacrifice. You see, Sasuke is being a narrative parallel to his older brother. Sasuke is becoming a monster out of the love for his brother, though the world may only perceive his terroristic retribution, not the love, just as Itachi was viewed as, and even in many respects, became a monster out of the love for his brother, slaughtering his entire family in the dead of night, making the ultimate decision to give his life as a pawn for Sasuke. Thus, we know that Itachi, after the massacre, and having been considered a rival to Obito, would only get exponentially more powerful, and possibly some more, as it's implied he would actually go on to find the ethereal spirit weapons, which would make his Susanoo hailed as the ultimate absolute defense, and even in context to Sasuke's Summit Susanoo, wherein it would only be equaled out by EMS Sasuke, which is stated to be the only form of Sasuke that rivals Itachi, and the earlier Kage Summit form is stated to be of a night and day difference. So by all metrics of the term, Itachi can kill Obito. Notice the wording there, can kill, and is likely a near equal fighter to him, so whoever you think would win this fight would only win like maybe 6.5, 7 out of 10 times, something like that. So let me wrap this back around, as we know of another man, if one ought to call him a man, who was built up for ultimate power. Databook 2 commentates on the end of part 1 and notes many things, such as Itachi making sport of every jonin, as mentioned earlier, and Kisame's reputation as the scourge of Kirigakure, but offered the question, who is their king-like leader? As if to posit that even though the Akatsuki are monsters, I mean, look at these two members here. How strong would one have to be to head a group like this? And as we know, and resume into part 2, we see that much has changed, with Sasuke now towering over Naruto as if to show the difference between the two, and both of the remaining Akatsuki teams being shown, where a call would intercept the terror of Kakuzu and Hidan, the immortal duo who just struck down Asuma, a man whose strength actually rivals Kakashi, and in this call we see that the mysterious leader demands that they head back now. And as Hidan barks back, Kakuzu, the stronger of the two, shuts him down immediately, and as the camera pans to the shinobi, we see Pain sitting above the shinobi world, perhaps to show the difference between himself and such powers. Even in flashbacks, we see that this leadership even forced Itachi to shut down Sasori and Kisame's remarks, saying that they need to follow their leader's orders. He even once was hesitant to discuss Naruto's personality, but Pain demands that he spews it out, to which he does. But why do they do this? Why are these powerful members obeying Pain so willfully? Well, Databook 3 posits the same question and states that even the notoriously strong members obey him for his charisma and power that no one can deny, attributing that which no one can deny to power especially, showing how Itachi, Kakuzu, and even Sasori in one instance act as though Pain is just someone you shouldn't disobey, with this same Databook calling him actually invincible in comparison to the strongest Akatsuki members, which implies that he can't be overcome in a fight by any Akatsuki member, which would necessarily include Itachi. And all of this aligns with how the Akatsuki's intel gatherer, Zetsu, remarks that he, despite having seen Itachi's Susanoo and MS abilities, and even calling him invincible, never imagined that Pain would have been defeated, at least under the limitations of his knowledge and those who he would actually believe would challenge Pain, which could rule out Itachi and more so focus on any Kage Jinchuriki, or elite Jonin, which also sits well with Jiraiya's argument just prior to his death, believing that he has to continue to forge on as nobody else in the world could really get this far against pain. We also know that other elite shinobi like Kakashi are also being placed as inferior to that of Jiraiya externally to this, like in the choice of Hokage, the strongest person in the world, but also through the relativity to Kakuzu, who had 2 lives taken out in a single attack by Naruto, which Obito notes, yet Konan pushes back on this, pushes back on Obito of all people, saying not to worry, he's never been defeated, implying that whatever you want to bring up of who did this or who did that, whoever could face pain now, victory is still at his fingertips alone. Furthering how the story is continuing to push that Pain is the strongest shinobi in the known world. As a matter of fact, this very end chapter synopsis statement does hail that next time, the strongest man in the Akatsuki pursues Naruto. And while edgy scalers will attempt to manipulate the true subject argument in favor of Itachi as he appears in the next chapter, we know Oxford Languages utilizes the intent to capture, or catch, as a necessary motive for pursuit definitionally. And Itachi's first words to Naruto are that he isn't there to capture him, and it's Pain who hunts down the strongest Biju, who he believed to be housed in the strongest country and the strongest village on the planet, bringing divine retribution from his perceived godhood. But even the strongest village is just irrelevant in comparison to the almighty leader of the Akatsuki. You see, for Pain, his best set of arguments are all hinging on databook and supporting remarks about his theophanies leading up to his final battle. And while some disagree with the use of chapter synopsis statements and the aforementioned secret volume guide for Road to Ninja, Kishimoto notes in an interview, I imagine most of you are reading the collected volumes, but the weekly Shonen Jump serialization is getting even more intense. So please read both if you can. Reading the volumes all at once is good, but I really want you to experience the thrill of waiting each week, wondering what's going to happen next. Which all pushes the idea of Kishimoto acknowledging the volume importance by the weekly anticipation is still unmatched. And a large part is due to the suspense that these next time chapter synopsis statements actually bring. Now you may be asking, Mr. Virtue, you haven't really ranked these members yet at all. Well, if you haven't noticed, allow me to explain. We know Pain's invincibility only stops when it reaches one man, Obito Uchiha, who is said to be the true leader of the Akatsuki, who won't tolerate failure from Pain, calling him an underling and even being hailed by Minato, even after witnessing Konoha's devastation, to be an entirely different tier of fighter than Pain, a tier that if Naruto ever hopes to reach, he needs to master the Nine Tails, which is in reference to KCM2. Furthermore, while many people stop here for White Mask Obito, we know that the Rinnegan granted him only a new particular power in his chakra. We aren't really sure though if it physically amped him at all, considering the narrative fits much more consistently if it doesn't and aligns with the KCM2 performance against him, which means that this Obito has by far the highest physical assertions, being even close to Edo Madara, but it's still interesting when you account for those Itachi comparisons. So if you haven't noticed, we have this rock, paper, scissors set for these three opponents. Itachi over Obito, over Pain, over Itachi. However, I actually think you can rank them, and I'd put Obito in first. And if you aren't to assume that Pain's lore is exaggerated reputation, then he should sit in second and Itachi in third, which also fits with his Edo Tensei ability being actually capable of matching the higher forms of KCM1 Naruto speed in the chakra arms, which act as a parallel to the Susanoo avatar arms. So it's just like Obito is a KCM2 level threat, and Itachi is above a KCM1 level threat and close to a KCM 1.5 level threat, making the raw scaling for both he and Obito really consistent. However, one thing that's going to become particularly prominent within the ranking section is how we ought to truly rank these characters. If I want to give you guys the fullest understanding, there are three ways to do such that result in usually different placements, that being who's stronger in a vacuum, so raw power level. Then there's ranking based upon X beats or loses to his neighboring placements. And then third is how X loses or beats his neighboring placements if both are starting at their absolute peak ability. So starting in their highest forms, like Itachi would start in the Susanoo, for example. So how do they actually interact? Well, there's again about three ways to answer this complex question. Firstly, Obito should be, in my opinion, beating both Itachi and Pain, at least in character. That is due to his physical advantages and his ambiguity actually doing him some favors for the jutsu that he actually has access to, like his wood style and Kamui enhanced fire style. However, his greatest attribute in his Kamui is his speed. Now, theoretically, both his interactions come down to a single point for each. For Pain, it's dependent upon how you think the bodies could naturally function within the Kamui space, and while you can argue for the dimension being an infinite distance, and thus the chakra can't be transmitted, or you could argue that he would just get in there and use Obito as a punching bag, I think it's closer to the first infinite idea, as we know that things put in the Kamui space become contingent upon the chakra that they have there, as if to say the flow of external chakra is cut off. What do I mean? Well, we see in the case of Gaara that his sand can be put into Kamui, but slowly begins to lose its floating ability and falls just like normal sand gradually, and the best explanation for this is that the sand is naturally imbued with Gaara's chakra, so he can control it, and we know that that flow either can't be controlled or at that distance it was cut off. Either work for this discussion, and thus we know that the Pain bodies wouldn't work either. Now, in my last video, I actually covered this a bit more about while yes, the Pain bodies are dead, the organs and aspects of the body are still functioning due to Nagato's chakra. For example, they breathe, spew blood, produce saliva, and are reliant on their senses, like hearing, as shown against Jiraiya. I mean, they can be paralyzed, for example, meaning that the bodies would essentially just die out if they are put into the Kamui dimension. Meanwhile, in the real material world though, Pain actually does have some real advantages, namely in that he should be physically relative to, if not just actually stronger than Obito in terms of raw power, unless you hold to the point that he can restrain Minato and is thus as physically strong as Kurama, but I think that's a clear point of mechanical leverage over anything else, and we know that he actually did have a plan to kill Obito. We know in the chapter 363, we see that Konan appears in the darkness behind Pain and states that, "Pain, come, he's here," where he then walks in, giving us this banger album cover. Walking inward, Pain talks to who we know to be Obito about Sasuke's power, Itachi's looming demise, and that Pain must hunt down the Nine Tails, and that this mysterious leader won't accept failure. We cut away in the opening of the next chapter, but while the conversation continues, the skies are clear. It's a Sunday and it isn't supposed to rain, as noted later by the citizens when Jiraiya shows up. As Obito then begins to reach for his cloak, clouds then appear, and as he walks forward, rain picks up, and once he takes his first step onto the rain-covered concrete, thunderstorms then emerge, lightning erupting everywhere, and it's nearly pitch black out. Mind you, it's not supposed to rain, much less thunderstorm, especially in this time frame. The reason as to why this sequence of events of the rain developing alongside Obito's movements towards the outside is this is actually Pain's Rainmaker Jutsu, which allows for him to sense every drop of rain, as noted in Data Book 3. He wants to know something about Obito, and then in response, as if Pain has defied him in some way, activates his 3 Tomoe Sharingan to demonstrate his capability and then leaves. This is actually how the Kamui timer was exactly figured out by Konan, or at least it makes the most sense in comparison to the notion that she just figured it out by watching him pretty closely over the years or something like that, which just gives the notion that we know there was a plot by Pain to undermine Obito, or at the very least, he has a sensory counter to the Kamui intangibility timers. To support this, Konan notes, "The sky is weeping again," but then says, "Pain, are you?" As if to say that like he is doing something that she would recognize, but she's just not going to say it out loud. So ironically, Pain does have an advantage in regards to terrain, but ultimately you're asking too much to assert that he could just bridge that speed gap, at least if he's starting off in all 6 paths as opposed to a stronger singular body form Tendo, but that also forces him into only having one body for Obito to suck in. So Obito could beat Pain regardless of what state he really opens the fight in, and this is actually kind of similar for Itachi, as him starting off in the V4 Susanoo, capable of utilizing the mythical ethereal spirit weapons in the Totsuka Blade and Yadamir, would put him at a much stronger and faster state, and its actual best advantage is the Totsuka Blade, which can seal the body basically instantly, meaning that even though Tendo is more powerful and faster, Itachi could unironically beat Tendo if they both started off in their peak forms, but I actually think that the numerous one-shot abilities become less effective against the 6 different bodies, which should still be relative, if not superior to a non-Susanoo Itachi, and this is also relying on one aspect, and it's how fast Itachi pulls the Totsuka seal off, and I would reckon pretty quickly, but using the Edo Nagato v Itachi fight, we know that though KCM 1 Naruto acknowledges that Itachi's Amaterasu and Tsukiyomi would instantly wipe him out, and has actually already seen the Susanoo, he still believes that Chubaku Tensei places Pain on a whole other level of power and jutsu, which would imply that if it came out, Itachi's done for. As for how Itachi would interact with Obito, it really comes down to what specific method you think Itachi would kill Obito with. If it's the Totsuka Blade, then Itachi could actually stand at the peak of the Akatsuki if they all start at their peak forms like he starts in V4 Susanoo, but if not, then he should definitely be below Obito. Moving on to tier 2, we actually have another set of 3 fighters in Sasori, Kisame, and Deidara, which is actually really interesting, arguably really as close, if not closer, and honestly, in my opinion, much more interesting than the previous tier, despite many people arguing that Kisame, for example, is much more physically imposing than either Deidara or Sasori, but this tier is also relying on a very consistent theme and inherent purpose of the Akatsuki duos, being that each duo are meant to be an inhibitor for one another, at least in regards to the individual members. And what I mean is that in the Akatsuki novel, actually, it commentates on this and notes that each of the duos are meant to actually be able to stop the other member if they went rogue, which is why, for example, we know that Kakuzu and Hidan are nearly equals, reacting to the bomb tags at the same speed, reacting to Shiraku and, running at the same speeds, performing basically the same against Kakashi and Yugito, alluding to a very similar thing. But we also know that Yamato himself, a man who's been interacting with these Akatsuki level entities, remarks that Kisame was powerful enough to be paired with Itachi, and thus even with the bare bones manga interpretation, you have them being fundamentally related to power, and each group are hyper relative. So it's crucial to note and understand here that Sasori and Deidara should be placed shoulder to shoulder in these rankings, with Kisame either being above both or below both. And we can address that afterwards, but let's address how you would actually probably argue for who's actually stronger between Sasori and Deidara in scaling both of them, and then later wrapping Kisame scaling back around. Firstly, Deidara and Sasori need to be put into a box for their relation. And this is me just pulling back on their necessary relativity from earlier, which is just to say that any scaling that suggests that one is a blitz tier above the other probably is wrong or misinterpreted or something like that, right? Now, this follows with Sasori's birthday column, as it makes several notes about his rare genius taking pride in his third Kazekage puppet and the deceased's iron sand. His greatest accomplishment is turning himself into a puppet, wherein the column states, perhaps it could be said that he reached the pinnacle of his craft. Despite other puppet users being made known to us by this point, namely Chiyo, Konkuro, and Monzemon, Deidara, however, and also being a mirror to this, is hailed by Databook 3 to have created the pinnacle of all explosions in his C3 bomb, which would likely have actually bombed all of Tsunegakure, but the rest of the world doesn't know that he actually had another secret bomb in the C0, which perhaps could be even more powerful, and thus Deidara is also at the absolute pinnacle of his art form as well, thus suggesting that neither of them are vastly above the other. And this would be wrong if you take that, again, blitz difference rhetoric, which the whole notion at large doesn't really come from Sasori's performance against Chiyo and Sakura, but actually rather Deidara's performance against Sasuke, who's shown, even while not making a serious face like he does in the Deidara fight as an example, completely blitzing Sakura, where we see here that Deidara is capable of actually reacting to an even stronger Sasuke on low ends. By this point, Sasuke is stated to have actually continued his training with the manga using the same rhetoric for Naruto's intense training that gave him over a year of training in a very short time frame, except for Sasuke, it's actually stated by the Kizuna Earth Scroll that he's also gained more hatred and thus more power as he's gained from his training due to his chakra changing into a colder and thicker state. Deidara can still react to this very late initial body flicker attempt, while many people, including myself, at one point in the past, have been guilty of saying that Sasuke covered a much larger distance before Deidara started to react, and thus if that distance was shorter, he would have been blitzed. But this simply doesn't work, seeing as we know that Sasuke had to exit his body flicker state at some point. As soon as he did, Deidara then noticed the speed and completely backflipped onto a nearby tree, covering a much greater distance in terms of combat speed than Sasuke. However, I'm not claiming he's faster, just that it's disingenuous to argue that Sasuke is much faster than Deidara at that initial point. Furthermore, even when Sasuke does get behind him, Deidara can still react in a combat speed by tossing up a C1 bomb, although still getting cut by the Kusanagi sword. However, let's go back to a sequence, as you can see this sort of theme throughout this fight. When Sasuke tosses the Senbon as a response to these C1 insects, Deidara is focused on Tobi when Sasuke gets behind him. Point being is that all the instances where Sasuke looks super impressive, it's usually because something is hindering Deidara in that moment, with the largest factor of the which being his pride. For Deidara, this fight means everything. Several years ago, Deidara, whose reputation was expanding a lot through a set of terrorist bomb jobs for neighboring nations, the Akatsuki reached out to him, showing up to his door, and, quote, up until this point, Deidara had believed his artistic ninjutsu to be flawless, but it fails to even so much as make Itachi blink, finding himself unconsciously admiring Itachi's own artistry. Deidara seems to feel a brief sense of inferiority, swearing not to lose to Itachi or the Sharingan. He joins the Akatsuki and awaits his chance for revenge, end quote, as said by the birthday columns. You see, for Deidara, his revenge here is not just by killing Sasuke, but by beating the Sharingan. His goal is totally in the wrong spot. Deidara doesn't use the face-attaching bombs or his speed birds that can blitz around all of Gaara's sand. He doesn't even use his thermal goggles like he should have. Why? Because he's trying to just best the Sharingan. He's not trying to actually change and level up his bombs and use the IQ plays. No, he skips right over C3, his pinnacle explosion, and opts for C4. Why? Because it was explicitly designed for Itachi. He wants to prove to himself that it's going to work. You get my point? Deidara is fighting like a moron, and it should be said like Sasori, for example, using the Hiriko as his only weapon just to prove that he's a better puppet user. And when you look closely at this, you'll see that Deidara physically does some pretty impressive things, such as when he's capable of perceiving and reacting to CM2 Sasuke pulling the strings for the shuriken behind him, to which he couldn't actually react via moving his giant bird, which is in flight speed, a speed generally faster than his typical speed. Just following that, once the dragon falls, we then see before the dragon touches the ground, Deidara and CM2 Sasuke react relatively through Deidara catching a foothold and kicking one shuriken out, somehow removing the other, also to toss off the Akatsuki cloak, and while Sasuke just weaves signs for a bodily snake to save himself. And thus, in that tiny time frame, Deidara also had to summon this bird through hand movements, which would also probably be hindered due to the injuries to his arms due to those shuriken that even made his right hand cough up blood, showing once again that they would be moving comparably when Deidara is actually under pressure and the two have a fair comparison. And then Deidara's not off guard or focused on something else, like how he previously was focused and he dominated Gaara. Yes, he dominated Gaara tactically and the Three Tails, Hisobu, dropping a single C2 bomb. However, all of this seems a bit weird when Sasori was more comparable to Sakura and Chio, making Deidara the clear favorite, right? Well, not necessarily. And the reasoning being is that you probably know that Deidara actually concedes to Kakashi and Naruto that Sasori is stronger than I. Probably. Yeah. Now, this statement actually implies a lot. However, seeing as it's one of the most complicated statements in the series, believe it or not, as I'm sure most of you have heard the counter to this being that Deidara, in knowing Kakashi's reputation and wanting less opponents, lied about Sasori's strengths and hoped that Kakashi would just go away so he could not have to battle the supposed strongest fighter, whatever. Now, in Sasori's benefit, however, I've addressed this before in videos such as Four Tails Naruto versus the Akatsuki via arguing something akin to such thought can't track on the basis of it presupposing Deidara and a sense of care for his own self-well-being, which would be contradicted by the aforementioned antagonizing he did to rile Naruto up. And while this does track if you offer up Deidara wanting the Nine Tails to come out so he can actually just not blow Naruto all to hell, and putting that as the reason for why Deidara did that, and why it neither has to be and more than likely is not out of his own self-interest, at least in terms of him wanting to protect himself and whatnot, and hence therefore Deidara is still lying about Sasori's power. However, this reason here doesn't give a necessary cause for why it's a complete lie, and what I mean is what in this argument means it's a lie. Well, nothing really, and those two don't connect. If Sasori is stronger and Deidara offers this up, then the point and argument still works, and it's not a lie, with the only real reason being whenever you appeal to external feats, which kind of defeats the purpose of analyzing this statement. With that being said, I would actually go to vouch to and actually posit that while yes, Deidara does have substantially better speed showings, Sasori simply never got the proper chance to display his own, even more than Deidara's hindered display against Sasuke. And therefore, it's not as easy to say that Deidara is stronger via feats and therefore this is a lie, as Sasori's speed ceilings are left relatively ambiguous and his Iron Sand is at least stronger than Deidara's bombs, seeing as the Iron Sand is stated to be the most fearsome weapon in all of Tsunegakure, unironically excluding a time clause implying it's greater than everything in Tsuna's history, placing it namely above the One-Tailed Shikaku and Gaara's Sand, which is obviously worse, yet it could tank Deidara's pinnacle attack in the C3. Therefore, maybe you would have a similar basis to assert that since the Iron Sand is stronger than Deidara's bombs, he'd be faster, or something like that. But we practically don't know, and that's a bit of a jump for me to have to make, and it essentially could fall either way depending on how you interpret Sasori's scaling, which also, real quick, him having sand stronger than Gaara, meaning he could tank C3, doesn't mean he would win, seeing as Sasori's third Kazekage has vastly less sand than Gaara's, and Deidara could still weave around it and hit Sasori point blank with speed birds if again you subscribe to his speed scaling, which albeit is more concrete than Sasori's by a large margin, which relies on more or less an awkward leap in argumentation, meaning that I would personally lean towards Deidara, but I probably wouldn't look at you weird if you subscribe to Sasori being the superior, as he never really got that true chance to display his power against Sakura and Chiyo, and actually does have some, and kind of has to be relative to Deidara in some regard. So it kind of puts him in like, well, we know he's stronger than what he's shown. Where that stops at, I don't know. And so that's why it's a bit awkward, because you don't know his fullest extent of his power, right? Now, furthermore, he actually does have some really solid stock elsewhere, and while many people would go straight to the assassination of the third Kazekage, I'm going to be blunt here. This interaction is far too ambiguous to really draw anything from at all in terms of how they would fight, much less that Sasori just beat him up in a stand-up fight as opposed to gassing the room in the middle of the night while he was sleeping or whatever you pause it. We also know a strategy like this is inherently more likely than him destroying him, as we know it was a difficult opponent for Sasori, so perhaps he poisoned the room, the Kazekage then attacked and then fell due to the paralyzing factor, which covers both grounds. Regardless, there's a lot of things you could posit as opposed to this he big boloed the third Kazekage. Regardless, Sasori does have better external links to characters like Orochimaru, one of the Sannin, hailed to be practically equal to Hiruzen and Taijutsu and standing at the peak of the shinobi world by virtue of the two being Akatsuki duos. And this could fit with him being above Chiyo, a former and potentially still Tsunade rival if you go off the 1 Decade 100 Ninja Guide stating that she has undiminished power. However, as a blatant rung for the Sannin tier, we know that they are known to boast power capable of destroying a small country, and Sasori with his 100 puppet jutsu is stated to have taken down an entire country before. Chiyo even notes that he's developed so much, likely since he actually once politically disrupted a great nation itself. And we know for sure that this Sannin level, Orochimaru in particular, is implied to be above the Sasuke that fought Deidara, showing how each have assertions that sit above one another like rungs on a ladder. However, in me actually asserting who's above the other, it's actually weirdly complicated. I mean that in that Sasori is slightly above Deidara if you go off all this. However, Deidara would probably beat the absolute brakes off this dude in a fight, stylistically speaking, as we know that he can maneuver in ways to overwhelm the sand with the speed birds. He has better diversionary abilities with the C1 insects, which he can toss 20 out for pressure. He has Bijou nuking abilities for forcing Sasori in the offense, and we know that Deidara does and can fly into the atmosphere and take the sand battle to the skies, which is really bad for Sasori, as he doesn't innately take the third into the sky in a sort of flying manner like Gaara does, really at all. So it's going to be a pretty defensive fight for Sasori, except even if you're going to grant his above Gaara and thus C3 scaling, it doesn't even work, as he isn't going to be pulling the entire village worth of sand and has less iron sand than even Gaara's basic reserves. Furthermore, when you account for the fact that he knows of Sasori's abilities, it gets much weirder for any argument of how Sasori would actually beat Deidara in a fight, because we know that Deidara is a long-range fighter, as stated in Data Book 3, and if he's not way out of his mind, he'll play to that really well, which is why his flight speed is actually not just above his combat speed, but above his bomb's explosive velocity as well, as shown when Akatsuki could react to it, but could barely even see Deidara matching Onaki's peak flight speed. This explosive velocity-based speed is also vastly beyond Sasuke, and even his curse spark variations of him at that. So when we draw this back around to their physicals, Deidara could then rival any superiority you possibly were going to grant Sasori prior in his flight speed. Then you account for his C4, which is heavily implied to be equal to Onaki's particle style, if you could believe it, and then you have to ask, what does Sasori do if he had to fight Deidara? Like, really nothing. If anything, the only thing Sasori has is just their relational interactions, like the Deidara statement or how Deidara respects Sasori and even calls him sir, with Sasori believing he could kill Deidara in the war. Although, since he doesn't have a single puppet or weapon, I doubt this. But again, if you take it, how would he do this? Bro, only God knows. I don't know. This is also really similar to a more extreme version of the Itachi-Obito comparisons, where we know the two have to be relative, and one is relationally implied to be capable of killing the other, but how would he possibly do that? Bro, who knows? And if this one is even more extreme because it's even more outlandish to posit ways for Sasori to kill Deidara. Also, we know that Deidara is well aware of Sasori's core and weakness if you want to bring up this Edo encounter, and even somewhat jokes about it being so blatant. And if you're really going to tell me that Deidara, knowing that weakness without really any chance of being pressured offensively, couldn't hit that, then I can't help you. Now, let me draw Kisame around to this to show how this gets even physically more awkward, as Kisame is stronger and faster than both Sasori and Deidara, as we know that he's relative to Itachi through not just the duo assortment, but medians like these Storm games imply that he's relative to a 3-tomo Itachi, but not an MS Itachi, which fits with their interaction and introduction to one another, where Kisame is confident in pressing Itachi until he sees the MS, then he's done. Furthermore, we know that he's capable of also reacting to a version 1 Killer B, draining his chakra, and potentially reacting to a V2B on lower ends. Now, while people usually stop here, this does not link him to either Sasori or Deidara, so we have to take it a bit further, as you'll find something also pretty interesting. But let me dial it back to his Itachi comparison, because many people assume that this means he's way above Heavy Sasuke, because Sig Itachi was way above Heavy Sasuke. But this doesn't mean that. While it does imply that Kisame should be physically above Sasuke, he doesn't dwarf him, as we see that Sasuke's fireball could genuinely overpower Itachi's, as the 10th Manly Chronicle Guide and 3rd Data Book basically outright say as much. So Sasuke should still have competing ninjutsu with Kisame, even if he's a bit faster and slightly physically more, dense. If you go back to the B fight, however, he enters his fused state, which is stated to have no weaknesses and display him as, quote, the Akatsuki's monster, where in this form, he actually dominates V2B underwater, which is actually a parallel form to the Raikage's V1 and V2 states, which could imply that Kisame's performance against B may make him above the V2 level, which is likely only slightly above B's B2 level, and obviously this would transcend Sasuke's summit form, at least in the earlier parts, including aspects of him with the Susanoo, where he's stated to be basically far beyond his CM2 heavy state. However, this can also still track even if you don't think he eclipses V2A and only eclipses V1A, which is also consistent with how even when not amped by B's chakra, well, at least too much anyway, he can break Yamato's wood-style constructs, which could previously restrain Four-Tails Naruto, who is implied to be physically relative to or even surpassing CM2 heavy Sasuke. All this to say that Kisame, at least when he's trying or is in his perfect form, would be above those Sasuke levels, putting him relative to or in that same tier as Sasori and Deidara. And I say relative rather than directly above, as we know that B's chakra was heavily amping him in this fight. So this tier is also much closer than most people will ever give it credit for. But what's weird is if you say that Kisame is above Deidara, but saying he beats up Deidara is a totally different claim, and we run into the similar idea of X is above Deidara but couldn't beat Deidara. Now, I suppose that Kisame does have a better stylistic chance than Sasori, due to his water style being pretty monstrous, and he might be able to cover some better distances, but ones like the Shockwave and Bubble would be hard countered by Deidara's flight ability, and weirdly enough, many people will also say that Deidara could still bomb bodies of water, even though it's suppressed, and they'll cite the Asobu example. But the problem here is, while yes, water is a medium 800 times denser than air, this also means that the shockwaves can actually travel much faster, and the initial blast and pressure underwater can be 10 to 100 times greater than in the air for the local radius, meaning that underwater it's a much more lethal local radius, but a less lethal one at farther ranges due to the water being able to absorb energy quite efficiently. The pressure then drops off pretty fast with distance, but no, it wasn't really suppressed against Isobu, who's actually massively more powerful. And the same would go for Kisame here if he had it dropped on him in the bubble. So let me ask, if you think Kisame can tank a C2 or C3, could he tank a 100 times multiplied C2 or C3? Now, I'll give Kisame a slight advantage in his Super Shark Bomb, which could theoretically absorb them, adding to the power back to Kisame. However, the function of how he actually does this, does he absorb the kinetic energy of the blast or the initial chakra that explodes? Well, I'd probably go with the initial chakra that explodes, as it should operate similar to a summoning, where the chakra is more or less the opening act for the jutsu to begin to function, or the, act or action to begin to function, but there's still something else that doesn't require chakra, for example, like the explosion. So he's not going to actually absorb the kinetic energy, but he can absorb, theoretically, the initial chakra out of the bombs. But regardless, we also know that C4 is still very much a problem and would kill both him and Samehada, and the same goes for Kisame as it did for Sasori, that Deidara has better feign abilities, better diversion abilities, better pressure abilities, and has the aerial advantage. So while Kisame is a bit questionable for if he'd lose, you'll see that even though both he and Sasori are possibly stronger, they would still lose to or struggle greatly against Deidara. Therefore, it comes down to how you prefer to rank the list, either by who's greater in a vacuum, who wins against the neighboring characters. If you go with the former, then it should go Kisame, Sasori, and then Deidara in last. But if you go with everything included, starting at their peak states like we mentioned, it should go Kisame, Deidara, and then Sasori. And if you want to go with the fight method, then it should go Deidara, Sasori, then Kisame at last, because if Sasori and Kisame are relative, we have seen Kisame struggle with poison in the Akatsuki novel, but I'm not mad if you're going to swap that around, considering it's one of the 3 possible methods to rank them. So if you could believe it, this tier is actually really, in my opinion, the most interesting and funnest to talk about. Now, wait, we're in tier 3, and if you've made it this far, come on, man, you gotta subscribe. You clearly like it, you clearly listening to it, and, are you doing the dishes, you're driving, I don't know what you're doing, but maybe you're at work, I don't know. But anyway, subscribe if you're enjoying the content. Moving into tier 3, I want to firstly open by noting how the tiers are the way they are, and it's that the weakest member of the highest tier can be any member of the lower tier, including the strongest, and no matter who you interpret to be the strongest, they probably can't beat or be stronger than either Deidara or Sasori, even if it's just by barely. Now, the conversation for how to rank this tier is more cut and dry, at least for one member, and that's Hidan, as he himself knows that he's the slowest and has the worst aim amongst the Akatsuki. However, I'm going to play a bit of devil's advocate here and bring up something I've noted for years that is not touched on, and it's that Hidan is lying. Yes, he's literally lying, like he's literally trying to bait Yugito, the Two-Tails Jinchuriki, out and force her into a fight. That's exactly what he does do, as once she actually does come out, he laughs, saying he's like a trapped mouse in a very satirical way, knowing he's about to kill her. And what's a better way to lure her out than say, hey, I never captured the Jinchuriki and I'm the slowest and my aim sucks, I can't beat her? And that's exactly what he does, and then she comes out in what the chapter synopsis calls an effortless capture. And we know that we put this into question in the fight, as he's not only able to show relativity to Kakuzu, as he does in literally all of their interactions, but even tanking the natural disaster level win style, with his aim in particular almost certainly being a lie. Because against Asuma, he could do a spinning backflip and throw his cord scythe to just slice the cheek of Asuma, all while dodging the shadow paralysis mid-air. So worst aim? Yeah, I doubt it. Furthermore, even his basic control over the scythe is pretty crazy, as we can see him manipulate the cord to block literal kunai. And with the aforementioned point of the duos, if Hidan is just blatantly weaker and slower and outright inferior to Kakuzu in every way, how would he possibly stop him if he went rogue? Well, he couldn't. I mean, Kakuzu has honestly the most busted set of abilities in this tier, so the two kind of need to be neighboring in their placement, even if you have Kakuzu above, and I would actually argue that it's much more consistent if you have Kakuzu and Hidan to be like nigh equal in terms of physicality. Furthermore, physically, we know that against one another, the closest we get is Hidan actually being able to push Kakuzu back against the tree with his scythe attacks when under shadow paralysis, and he's also capable of tanking Kakuzu's natural disaster level wind heart, making the case for Hidan pretty close, if not nigh equal to base Kakuzu, physically being pretty solid. But that brings me to Konan. Now look, I know, talking about Konan scaling gets your head blown off, but it's actually kind of simple. We know that Konan is partnered with Pain, however, she obviously shouldn't scale to him, and she probably isn't meant to stop him, as she was also more so a foundational character in bringing together the Akatsuki, and those concepts are more so that they can group together international terrorists who don't share a common goal at all, and make it so they won't kill each other. But seeing as both her and Pain trust each other, they're also kind of the formation of this idea, there's really no way to say that she has to be relative to Pain at all. However, we know that Konan's most appealing set of feats is when she stages her massive defensive plan for Amegakure, filling the ocean with 600 billion paper bombs and drawing back on her research she's done with Pain over the years, calling back to his Rainmaker plot, which she seemed to have recognized. However, the question of whether or not she actually scales to Obito is a totally different animal, so let's run over the best possible answer for how she might scale to Obito, and then why I do or don't subscribe to such. So for the opening of the fight, it presents probably the best argument for Konan having low-end relativity, and it's that she has a suicide bomb plot, and it actually was fast enough and unpredictable enough for Obito to believe that he needed to try harder against her, as he underestimated her ability despite her being an Akatsuki member. Later, we know that as he reaches for his mask, she can lock multiple bombs on different parts of his, body and stuff in that time frame, where he then reacts, and she already had them move to do so, possibly implying that her speed was on that level. And then he actually admits that if he hadn't switched from flying to slipping past the explosion, it would have been bad. However, that initial speed point, the reason why I'm not super confident in that argument is that he actually has his hand stalled near his mask, as he needs to reveal the eye for the Izanagi to work, so he's kind of just waiting for timing, and he does this for, well, multiple pages on end. So while it's very much possible that she scales on a very low end to Obito, I think it's more so that her abilities and trap was good enough to place him in an advantageous position where he could then use an ability she couldn't possibly account for. So while I don't particularly agree with her scaling to Obito, it's more so that as a fighter in this situation, she played her plan, distance, and trap perfectly, and what was he supposed to do? Now, I should firstly note that yes, her paper bombs are like blades in Naruto, where they can kind of always remain relevant due to chakra allocation at the initial point of the explosion to, kind of help fight other characters like Kakuzu, for example, as he, even being, notorious for having the solid earth defense, he also puts his hands up to block paper bombs and stuff like that. Which brings me into Kakuzu and how she would actually relate to him, and it's that we know Kakuzu is pretty strong, being capable of housing jutsu that can halt two Raikiri at the same time, overpower Kakashi's water wall, and even use his tendrils to slam Kakashi into terrible positions, and possibly being a Kamui is needed sort of threat. If you are to take the anime's extended variation of the fight into account, then you have an absolute banger of a taijutsu fight, but more importantly, his hearts can actually operate on how they probably should and actually do in the war arc, where they're actually flying around in the air and shooting a jutsu out, autonomously. So Konan would definitely be in some trouble in the air just due to the number of opponents. However, her best physical assertions and why I would possibly see her being above Kakuzu in a vacuum is that she actually is capable of completely reacting to Jiraiya's flame bombs in this scene here, moving back faster than it travels, which seemingly is pretty impressive and demonstrates her Sannin level that's not really reached by either Kakuzu or Hidan. And while yes, Kakashi is a beast, Jiraiya isn't chosen as Hokage over him multiple times and seems to be presented as the higher threat at this point, and thus Konan seems to be a higher threat in a vacuum, and thus should be ranked above Kakuzu and then hence Hidan. However, if you think that Sasori doesn't really eclipse Sakura and Chiyo, then perhaps Kakuzu may have a good assertion to be in that tier, or at least close to Sasori, who does have some Sannin level assertions too. On the contrary though, I'm not really sure how much these flame bombs even backscale back to Jiraiya, typically, as it's more so ambiguous as opposed to Konan favored. If you are to take the interpretation of Kakuzu being above Kakashi overall, then you could present the argument of, since Kakashi isn't his top end, the aforementioned Sannin level that she reached, Kakuzu's best argument still also stems from the fact that he, more so in scaling above Kakashi, but also would scale above Sakura, who's capable of combating Sasori. And while this does presuppose that, Sakura is the same power and not being amped in either instance, that's if you're really trying to give Kakuzu the benefit of the doubt. Now, if these tier 3 combatants were to fight, Kakuzu is implied to be at least a slight superior to Hidan, and Konan could actually recreate the paper bomb trap that killed him, so it really comes down to Konan versus Kakuzu. So if they are in character, then Konan should probably win with, being able to actually match the aerial flight and stuff like that, and has a slightly higher assertion if you are to take the Sannin scaling, but again, it's only if you're going to be really generous, whereas Kakuzu actually just has better assertions overall outside of that, and much more concrete and conservative ones that scale to characters like Kakashi, where if you just take away Konan's Sannin stuff, she literally does nothing and has no scaling at all. And if he also has this Jiangu state, as in they all start off at their peak states, then he absolutely decimates her. Now, before closing the video out, I also kind of want to discuss the mighty immortal duo to flesh out Kakuzu's placement, and while many people began to settle down on his ranking within the Akatsuki, many also haven't and still view him as either a pain-rivaling threat or at least a high tier 2 level fighter. There are two primary arguments for why Kakuzu should be on that tier, and I don't really agree with one, and the other is almost never brought up, and I'm admittedly a bit more sympathetic towards that one. The former is that Kakuzu is able to react to Matatabi's downward Paw Strike, which albeit did sink him into the ground, which should still present a speed precedent of him being above Matatabi and thus above Yugito's lower transformations. However, let's firstly take note of Matatabi's initial position when transformed. Kakuzu is standing slightly in front of Hidan, and although both he and Kakuzu are still a solid distance from Matatabi's standing position, both of Matatabi's paws are stabilized near her mid-knee section, with the left one being closer to Hidan and Kakuzu's position than the right one. On the next page, you see that Yugito has now cocked her hand back fully, ready to strike, in which it's blatantly shown now that their aforementioned right paw is all the way behind her head, where Kakuzu sometime during the full attack, including primarily the draw time, was able to simply put his hands up. The example I gave back in my older Kakuzu vs. Pain video is imagine that both you and I are in a boxing ring. I'm a far better boxer than you speed-wise, and I want to hit you with a very strong blow, so I wind my arm up really far and completely rotate to hit you with a mean haymaker. You could obviously put your arms up because you could see my attack coming from a mile away before it was ever set in motion. This follows the exact same concept here. Kakuzu is only really scaling to the full attack, including largely the drawback speed, if you're being generous, not really the strike itself. Furthermore, we also know that having been called quite the technician by Shikamaru, the IQ precedent is there for Kakuzu, and evading would have been far more advantageous than blocking, which implies that this speed was also a very fast thing for Kakuzu to react to, and he didn't have many options in, said speed. The next problem is when you try to link this Paw Strike to the one used against KCM1 Naruto in the war, where Yugito was only in her V2 state. Now, this gets a little bit weird because Naruto is still recovering from the prior attack and simply tanked her attack, and this is also after B already notes multiple times that they're fighting much differently than when they were alive due to their Sharingan and Rinnegan projections, with the Sharingan possibly being real and actually amplifying their physicals. Furthermore, Killer B and Yugito Ni are both from Kumo Gakure, representing both the 8 and 2 tails respectively, hence to why Yugito's name Ni translates to second, likely talking about its second to the 8 tails, which is fitting with how at the previous Jinchuriki's funeral, the Kumo citizens remarked that the 8 tails is always more destructive than the 2 tails, and that they always have to have a special gourd to seal the 8 tails, something shown to A the 4th when he was much younger and in contention for Raikage, yet in the tour around the village we don't get a single remark about anything difficult in putting away the 2 tails, alluding to it being far inferior to the 8 tails under this particular scaling chain. Though that would be really awkward. However, the latter of the two arguments is quite different. While I partially subscribe to this, I don't really think it innately speaks to Kakuzu being in higher tiers, but rather that this tier is still extremely powerful and aren't the runt of the litter by any means. So take this as the external to the ranking itself, if you will. And after realizing the inferiority both he and the rest of Team 7 stand in before Sasuke, Naruto views Kakuzu as a trial he must overcome if he ever wants to bring down Sasuke. So with Sasuke being fixated on Naruto, he takes these immortal fighters who even brought divine retribution on Asuma, one of the least strongest jonin. So how does Naruto perform when battling elements beyond the laws of nature, physics, or logic in these immortal fighters? Well, he has to get stronger. But the point here for Kakuzu is that both he and Hidan's introduction, we also get the debut of Pain, the Akatsuki's leader, and this is interesting as when you start to couple all those chapter synopsis statements, Kizuna commentaries, and later manga statements as I just done, it comes across as though Kakuzu and Hidan are setting the table for Pain and his power to not just seem unreasonable to where the story wouldn't function properly. So we begin to get characters who are augmenting once living hearts with chakra, forcing them to stay alive in an immortal body whose ninjutsu begins to even exceed Kakashi, Konoha's top jutsu master, which they then use divine retribution on Asuma. So perhaps as a preface to Pain, the case for their power can be pretty good, at least in a vacuum, but when you begin to start to link Sasuke back in the narrative, consider Deidara, it stops being so uniquely beneficial to the immortal duo, but more so applied to each one. But again, this is more so me hyping up this bottom tier because, again, they're not the runt of the litter. They are still really strong and deserving of the Akatsuki level. And that brings me to the end of the video. What do you guys think? I figured since you guys have been eating up the long analysis videos, I'd finally give you the ultimate Akatsuki ranking, really break it down in every way that I've kind of thought of. And it hasn't really been done on YouTube, at least in this way. So do you agree, disagree? Be sure to let me know in the comments below. Perhaps what do you want to see next in terms of the longer content videos. But more importantly, may God bless you all. Love you guys.